Hey everyone, so we are going to continue on from the first part where you read through the chapter excerpt and continue talking about global patterns and classifications of economic development. So one thing I want you guys to do on this first slide is just to think through a couple different metrics that would point towards a country's economic development. So in question number one, what sorts of things make a country develop? So thinking through some of the metrics, some of the areas, some of the categories that would show that a country has developed or has gotten better over time. The second one, what sorts of metrics could we use to classify economic development? So how do we actually measure this particular economic development? And then the third question here, how can we rank or rate countries based on their development, both in economic terms and then in anything that does not have to do with money or commerce or anything like that, just non-economic terms. So take a few minutes here and go ahead and do that. So in terms of just looking at, how we define a country being developed, the World Bank really goes based on an individual's income or the average income within a country. So according to the World Bank, a high income country, or an HIC, has a per capita income of over $12,735. This is as of 10 years ago. Uh, the term HIC oftentimes becomes interchangeably used with developed. The United States is a high income country. Middle income countries, these are countries that are between $1,026 and $12,475 per capita, meaning that on average each person, in a middle income country earns somewhere between there per year. And so if we're looking at most of the world, some 5 billion people live in this middle income area. Low income countries, this is where people earn less than $1,025 US per year. And so thinking through and being able to identify certain countries based on whether they are high income or middle income or low income is going to be important. Now, in terms of this next question, just thinking through, how sort of trends have changed over time. There's a couple different metrics that we're going to look at here. And what I want you guys to do is to choose one of those to explain in terms of what you felt was most surprising or, sort of fit the most for you. So in terms of looking at these trends, one of the trends, the percentage of people living in low-income countries fell by 80% between 94 and 2014. The next one, in 1994, 3.1 billion people lived in 64 different low-income countries. But by 2014, there were just 600 million people living in 30 low-income countries. So 34 countries graduated to that middle income area. So countries like Bangladesh and Kenya, these have moved out of the low-income country area and low-income country category due to this economic growth. And that's really something that we've seen globally. Things are improving. Then the income for high-income countries has also increased massively. So for example, one of the most high-paying or high-income countries is Norway. So this rose from $26,000 to $103,000 during the same 1994 to 2014 period. A couple other countries that have moved up from lower income countries to lower middle income countries. There are, areas such as India, but also in terms of the upper middle income, countries like Mexico and China have moved up. And then there's also some countries that have gone from a middle income country to a high income country. So Argentina has become one, Hungary, Venezuela is one that is probably still a middle income country based on political and social things that are going on there. But there has been good movement across the globe as we've seen. So in terms of looking at the patterns here, I'm just going to name them out as we go here, but you can obviously see that there are a lot of high income countries, especially when we look at the Western world, so to speak. So North America, including the US and Canada, Chile, Argentina, in terms of South America, most, if not all, of Western Europe, and most of Europe overall. And then places like Saudi Arabia, which obviously have economic conditions that allow for that given their oil industries, Russia, and then a couple Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, as well as Australia. And then looking at middle income countries, we're starting to see some northern and southern African countries come into the middle income areas. Mexico, like we said before, Brazil, most of Southeast Asia, including China and India, other countries like Indonesia. All of these are part of the middle income brackets. And then in terms of where we're seeing those low income countries continue to be sub-Saharan Africa, so that area just south of the Sahara. There's quite a few countries that are still in that low income area. So in terms of economic classifications and how we sort of rank countries and rate countries, oftentimes we sort of look for ways to explain development and rate nations based upon their levels of economic development. So in the 1950s, there were really just two main categories. It was either you were developed or you were undeveloped. But in the 1970s, they came up with a new way, and this is one that we've used quite a lot over the last 50 years or so. But the first world countries would be those high income countries. Second income countries most often would be middle income countries, and then third world countries, sort of low income countries as well. This has been something that has, tended to go away though, as we have continued looking. In the 1970s, they also were a little bit more generalized in terms of looking at what was called the Brant Report. So thinking of things in terms of the global north, which tended to be generalized as being more wealthy, and the global south, which was branded as being more impoverished. However, that's obviously an overgeneralization, especially when we look at how development has continued to grow since the 1980s especially. And then in the 1990s, you had lower economically developing countries, or LEDCs, and then medium economically developing countries. And then finally, in the 2000s and then in the 2020s, you have developed or developing countries, and then low, middle, and high income countries, which is what we use today. Now, in terms of labeling, this is another way that things have changed. Previous labels focused only on economic development, but newer labels are starting to look at a lot of the different metrics that may show non-economic ways that a country could develop. So these new labels seek to take a broader look at a nation's development and also include many different aspects in there. So whereas old classifications would look at things like GDP or GNP, which is gross national product. GDP is gross domestic product. New measures seek to measure more human characteristics. And so you may see things like the Human Development Index being used, which takes into account things like equality, education, healthcare, infrastructure within a country, which can show a greater sense of development from throughout a country. Now, in terms of lower economically developing countries, there's a few things that we tend to see with these sorts of countries that are often low-income countries. So first is that they have high levels of agriculture. 70 to 90% of lower income countries are mostly involved in subsistence farming. And so that's where a family may farm only enough to have the food, have the resources that they themselves need. They're not necessarily selling it to larger markets. They are doing this in order to survive for themselves. You also have quite a lot of underemployment or unemployment. Workers may be reduced. Outputs would remain similar even with less people working within these countries because there is not as much, capital being made and as much money being made. There's also little income per person. Because there's little income per person, people are using everything that they need in order to survive on a daily basis. And so there's little to no savings. Government investment in infrastructure like roads and bridges is also very low. In addition, you also have services, housing, technology. These are also in very short supply within these countries as well. Now, in terms of characterizing these, once again, you have farms that are mostly small, not commercial. You also have birth rates that are extremely high. Death rates may be starting to drop, but they may also be very high depending on where the country is at in their developmental cycle. And then they also have population growth rates that are and can be high as well. Now, given the lack of infrastructure and spending in things like education, you may have a highly illiterate or a population that the number of people who can read and write within that language may be also high. You also tend to see governments that are unstable. You often have authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. Which makes sense given that they're not investing back in their people and maybe corruption is high as well. And then people have little ability to change their surroundings, mostly due to, very few people at the top having power and safeguarding a limited number of resources. So one last thing, just in terms of wrapping up this particular section, a couple different ways to classify, once again, is if you're looking at it purely from an economic perspective, you may look at the percentage of labor that's in agriculture, which again may point towards a more low-income country if a very high amount of people are in agriculture. Also, energy consumption per capita, GDP, which as I said is gross domestic product, GNI, gross national income. Looking at all of those sorts of measures may tell you about the development economically. In terms of social development, literacy rates, so again the number of people who are reading, as well as the population per doctor may also tell you a lot about development within that country. And then finally, demographic development. So just in terms of looking at the population itself. Is life expectancy rising? If so, that is a country that is continuing to develop and going in the right direction, as well as infant mortality rates in terms of the number of babies who are dying within that particular culture. And so, if those birth rates or those infant death rates are high, then you can point towards a culture that is not, a country that is not developing as much. All right, if you have any questions over economic classifications, please let me know. And other than that, have a great day. Bye.